something. Carney needs 70% of all output of Canada goes to 26 states. They're the biggest trading partners, Canada, and for those states, Canada's their biggest trading partner.
Kevin O'Leary warned that Canada cannot replace the United States economically. And on the surface, that sounds obvious. America remains Canada's largest trading partner. The two economies are deeply integrated, and billions of dollars still cross the border every single day. But what O'Leary may have completely underestimated is this. Trump's own tariff strategy is now pushing Canada to do something Ottawa avoided for decades: actively reduce its dependence on Washington. And the most surprising part is that this shift is no longer theoretical. The trade numbers are changing, global investment patterns are changing, and Canada's diplomatic posture under Prime Minister Mark Carney is changing along with them. In other words, Trump's pressure campaign may be creating the exact outcome Washington wanted to prevent. The controversy erupted after Donald Trump suddenly reversed his tone on Canada's expanding trade engagement with China. Only days earlier, Trump publicly said Canada signing trade arrangements with China was a good thing, before abruptly pivoting towards threats of massive tariffs against Canadian goods. Kevin O'Leary defended the broader Trump approach by arguing that Canada ultimately still has no realistic alternative to the American economy. His reasoning was straightforward. Roughly 70% of Canadian exports still flow into the United States, and smaller trade partners cannot fully replace the scale of the American market. Technically, that argument is still true today. No serious economist believes Europe, Asia, or China alone can suddenly replace the United States overnight. But that was never really Carney's strategy. The strategy emerging in Ottawa now is not about replacing America entirely. It is about making sure Canada is never again trapped in a position where one White House can threaten the entire Canadian economy through tariffs, political pressure, or sudden policy reversals. And over the last year, that strategy has quietly accelerated. For decades, Canada built its economy around the assumption that deep integration with the United States guaranteed long-term stability. That assumption shaped everything from manufacturing and energy infrastructure to transportation corridors and industrial supply chains. Trump's second-term tariff strategy appears to have shattered that confidence. Because once Canadian businesses and policymakers realized access to the American market could suddenly become conditional on political loyalty, diversification stopped being a distant policy discussion and became a national economic priority. That is why Ottawa has aggressively expanded trade and strategic outreach across Europe and Asia over the last year. Canadian LNG projects gained increasing importance as Europe searched for stable democratic energy suppliers outside politically volatile environments. At the same time, Canada deepened industrial and defense cooperation with South Korea, Japan, India, and ASEAN economies, while expanding discussions around critical minerals, Arctic logistics, and advanced manufacturing partnerships. Even China, despite years of diplomatic tension, has partially reopened several trade channels with Canada tied to agriculture and electric vehicles. That does not mean Canada is abandoning the United States. It means Canada is building insurance. And importantly, the numbers are beginning to reflect that shift. Canada's share of exports going to the United States has already declined noticeably compared to previous years, while exports to non-US countries surged to record levels. Economists increasingly describe the trend not as temporary diversification, but as the beginning of a structural adjustment in Canada's trade strategy. That is a major change.
The irony in O'Leary's comments is that while trying to explain why Canada still needs America, he unintentionally highlighted why Canada now has every incentive to reduce that dependence. Because Trump's tariff threats changed the political risk calculation inside Canada. For decades, economic integration with the United States was viewed almost entirely as a strength. Now, many Canadian policymakers increasingly see overdependence as a strategic vulnerability, and markets appear to understand this shift faster than politicians do. If investors genuinely believed Trump's trade war was going to permanently weaken Canada, capital would already be fleeing Canadian industries. Instead, investment continues flowing into Canadian energy, infrastructure, mining, Arctic development, and critical mineral projects. Why? Because Canada occupies a uniquely valuable position in the global economy at precisely the moment supply chains are being reorganized around geopolitical security. The United States needs Canadian oil, aluminum, uranium, potash, hydroelectricity, and critical minerals. Europe wants long-term access to Canadian LNG and resources. Asian economies are increasingly searching for stable, democratic partners capable of supplying industrial inputs outside unstable geopolitical zones. That means Canada's leverage is growing at the exact moment Washington assumed it would shrink. And that is where O'Leary's warning truly backfires. He framed diversification as unrealistic, but Trump's own policies are making diversification politically and economically unavoidable.
The deeper problem for Washington is not whether Canada can fully replace the American market tomorrow. That is not realistic, and nobody serious in Ottawa claims otherwise. The real issue is what happens over the next decade if Canada successfully reduces even part of its dependence on the United States. Because once trade routes, LNG terminals, infrastructure projects, supply chains, and industrial partnerships begin shifting outward, those changes become difficult to reverse. That matters enormously for the United States. Canada remains the largest export destination for 36 American states, while nearly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars in goods and services cross the border daily. Entire sectors of the American economy depend heavily on Canadian supply flows, including agriculture, manufacturing, energy, construction materials, and industrial processing. In other words, this relationship was never truly one-sided. And the more aggressively Washington weaponizes trade dependence, the more aggressively Ottawa will search for ways to reduce it. That dynamic may ultimately weaken American leverage far more than many in Washington currently realize.
What makes this moment politically important inside Canada is that many Canadians who once viewed diversification as unrealistic are starting to reconsider. Because Trump's tariffs fundamentally changed the emotional side of the relationship. For decades, Canadians accepted economic dependence on the United States because the relationship was viewed as stable, predictable, and mutually beneficial. But once tariffs, political threats, and economic pressure entered the equation, many Canadians began asking a different question. What happens if Washington stops acting like a reliable partner? That question is driving support for LNG expansion, Arctic infrastructure, critical mineral development, and broader trade diversification in ways that would have been politically difficult only a few years ago. And that may be the biggest shift of all. Trump did not just pressure Canada economically, he may have permanently changed how Canada thinks about dependence itself.
Kevin O'Leary warned that Canada cannot replace America, and in the short term, he is right. The United States will remain Canada's largest economic partner for the foreseeable future. But that misses the bigger story unfolding underneath the headlines. The real change is not Canada replacing America overnight. The real change is Canada finally deciding it no longer wants to depend entirely on Washington's political stability to secure its future. And ironically, Trump's own tariff strategy may be accelerating that transformation faster than any Canadian government could have done alone. That is why O'Leary's warning backfires so badly. Because the more Washington pressures Canada economically, the more determined Ottawa becomes to build a future where those threats matter less and less.
Several policies implemented by the Trump administration have strained relations between the United States and Canada and impacted pocketbooks on both sides of the border.
If you talk to any Republican in a border state, they know how damaging this has been. They're experiencing the same border.
A 27% drop in border crossings means nearly 1 million fewer visitors, and local U.S. economies are already breaking under the pressure. 1 million fewer Canadians crossed into the United States, and in some towns, that's enough to empty restaurants, cut revenues, and shake entire local economies. This isn't a policy move. It's something far more disruptive. Canadians are simply choosing not to go, and for parts of the U.S., that absence is starting to look like an economic crack spreading in real time.
The numbers are no longer subtle. Canadian travel to the United States has now declined for 13 straight months, with a 22% year-over-year drop in early 2026. That alone signals a structural shift, but the real impact becomes clearer at the local level. In Maine, cross-border traffic has fallen by roughly 27%, representing close to 1 million fewer visitors. For a state with a population of just 1.5 million, that is not a marginal loss. It is a direct hit to its economic core. The consequences are already visible. Restaurants that once relied on Canadian tourists during peak seasons now have open tables. Coastal towns that typically saw packed summer traffic are reporting noticeably thinner crowds. Retail stores that depended on weekend cross-border shoppers are seeing fewer transactions. To put the scale into perspective, if each Canadian visitor spends even a modest $300 to $500 per trip on food, fuel, lodging, and shopping, losing close to 1 million visitors translates into roughly $300 to $500 million in lost local spending in just one state. When extended across multiple border regions, the total economic impact easily moves into the billions. For small towns built around seasonal tourism, that kind of sudden demand drop is not cyclical. It's equivalent to losing an entire peak season in a single year. At the same time, the Canadian side is showing the opposite trend. Domestic tourism remains stable, international visitors are increasing, and overall tourism spending reached approximately $27 billion in the final quarter of 2025. Instead of leaving, Canadian spending is being absorbed and multiplied within the domestic economy. What is happening here doesn't look like a traditional boycott, but functionally, it behaves like one. There has been no official directive from Prime Minister Mark Carney's government telling Canadians to avoid the United States. No tariffs, no travel bans, no coordinated messaging. And yet, millions of Canadians are making the same decision at the same time. They are staying home. This is what a consumer-driven economic response looks like. It is decentralized, voluntary, and incredibly powerful. Instead of governments escalating tensions through policy, the public is adjusting behavior in ways that produce real economic consequences. And because it is not centrally controlled, it is far harder to reverse. There is no single lever to pull to bring those travelers back. The impact is not evenly distributed across the United States. It is concentrated in places that depend heavily on Canadian visitors, and that's where the cracks are forming first. Border states like Maine operate on a fragile balance. A significant portion of their tourism revenue comes from Canadian travelers who cross for shopping, dining, and seasonal vacations. When that flow drops by over a quarter, the system doesn't adjust smoothly, it strains. A loss of nearly 1 million visitors can translate into hundreds of millions of dollars in reduced local spending when accounting for accommodation, food services, and retail. For small businesses operating on tight margins, that is not a manageable decline. It is a shock. What makes this more striking is how quickly the effects appear. Unlike manufacturing or trade, which adjust over months or years, tourism responds almost immediately. Fewer visitors this season means fewer revenues now, not later. This situation exposes a growing disconnect inside the United States. At the federal level, President Donald Trump's second-term strategy continues to rely on economic pressure, tariffs, trade leverage, and a push to reshore production. The assumption is that these measures strengthen the U.S. position. But at the local level, the picture looks very different. Communities that depend on cross-border interaction are absorbing the unintended consequences. The pressure aimed at Canada is not producing visible concessions from Ottawa. Instead, it is reducing engagement, and with it, economic activity in U.S. border regions. Local officials understand this dynamic. Many recognize that fewer Canadian visitors mean weaker local economies. But challenging federal policy is politically complex, especially within the current climate. The result is a form of internalized pressure. The cost of the strategy is being paid domestically, not externally.
While parts of the U.S. economy are losing demand, Canada is doing something more strategic. It is capturing it. When Canadians choose to travel domestically, the economic impact does not disappear. It shifts. Spending that once supported U.S. businesses now circulates within Canada's own economy. Tourism is particularly powerful in this regard because of its multiplier effect. A single trip generates revenue across multiple sectors: transportation, accommodation, food services, entertainment. With over 700,000 jobs tied to tourism, even incremental increases in domestic activity can produce significant gains. At the same time, Canada is attracting more international visitors. That adds a second layer of inbound revenue, strengthening the sector further. The result is a system where lost outbound spending is replaced, and in some cases exceeded, by domestic and foreign demand. This is not just resilience, it is strategic redirection.
The most important question is whether this is temporary. The evidence suggests otherwise. Behavioral shifts, once established, tend to persist. Travelers develop new habits. Businesses adapt to new demand patterns. Domestic tourism infrastructure strengthens in response to increased activity. If Canadians continue to view domestic travel as more attractive, or if geopolitical tensions remain elevated, the current trend could become the new baseline. That would have long-term implications. U.S. border economies would need to adjust to permanently lower levels of Canadian traffic. Meanwhile, Canada would continue building a more self-sustaining tourism sector. In other words, what looks like a short-term dip could evolve into a structural realignment.
This is not a headline-driven collapse. There was no single moment where tourism suddenly stopped. But the effect is real, and it is accelerating. Fewer Canadians are crossing the border. Local U.S. economies are starting to feel the strain, and Canada is capturing more of its own economic activity in the process. What makes this shift so powerful is how it happens. No policy announcements, no dramatic escalation, just millions of individual decisions quietly adding up to a measurable economic force. The question now is simple. If Canadians don't come back, what fills the gap? Because for many U.S. border communities, that gap is already starting to show.